The chandeliers gleamed above, casting a golden shimmer across the polished marble that stretched from one end of the hall to the other. Soft music floated through the air, violins playing as waiters moved in quiet rhythm between the glittering guests. The gala had been carefully curated to dazzle. Crystal glasses caught the light, diamonds on wrists and throats sparkled like tiny galaxies, and the fragrance of rare flowers lingered in the warm air. Conversations blended into a low hum of laughter, clinking glasses, and the murmured language of wealth. Among the crowd stood Lawrence Halstead, his presence impossible to miss. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world bent at his whim. His tailored suit, stitched in Europe, fit as if the fabric itself had been woven with his arrogance. He held a glass of champagne in one hand, swirling it idly while his lips curved into a smirk. People surrounded him, eager to be entertained by his sharp wit or biting remarks. He thrived in these circles, not only because of his money, but because of his ability to draw laughter from cruelty. Moving along the edges of the room, careful to avoid notice, was Ruth. Her uniform was simple, crisp black dress, white apron, shoes polished until they caught the gleam of the chandelier's light. Her movements were efficient, her tray balanced perfectly as she navigated through the clusters of elites. She carried herself with quiet grace, yet she was invisible to those who sipped their wine and whispered deals worth millions. To them, she was only a servant, a shadow who existed to refill their glasses. Lawrence noticed her. He always noticed her. To him, she wasn't invisible but a perfect prop, someone he could use to elicit laughter, to show off his clever cruelty. Tonight, his eyes narrowed as he caught her slipping past, silent and focused. He tapped the leather-bound manuscript he had brought with him, its ancient cover weathered and cracked, and an idea formed. As though orchestrated, the conversations around him hushed when he cleared his throat. He was a man used to commanding attention, and he had no need to shout. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, lifting the manuscript, "behold a treasure I acquired just this week. An ancient text, written in a language so rare that even the experts at the auction admitted they couldn't fully decipher it." His tone was smug, each word measured to feed the curiosity of his audience. Guests leaned closer. A senator's wife leaned forward, diamonds glittering at her ears. An art collector adjusted his glasses. Everyone knew Lawrence's appetite for collecting unusual objects, whether fine art, relics, or, as many whispered, people's humiliation. Lawrence ran a finger over the faded script on the cover. "They say this piece is priceless. But I have a little idea to make it entertaining." His gaze swept the hall, and then, like a hawk swooping on prey, his eyes landed on Ruth. She had paused just a step too close, her tray held steady though her heart skipped at the sudden silence around her. Lawrence's smirk deepened. He gestured at her with a casual flick of his hand, as though summoning a servant was the same as commanding the universe itself. "You, Maid." His voice cut through the hall, smooth yet sharp. Every head turned toward her. She froze in place, her dark skin glowing faintly in the warm chandelier light, her eyes flicking quickly between the stares piercing into her. She lowered the tray slightly, her knuckles tightening around its edge. Lawrence raised the manuscript higher, presenting it as though it were a crown jewel. "How about a little game?" He let the anticipation stretch before adding, "If you can translate just one line from this book, I will give you my monthly salary." He paused, letting the number hover unspoken in the minds of the guests, an amount they all knew was obscene. His lips twisted into a grin. "That's more than you'll ever earn in your entire life." The crowd erupted into laughter. A man slapped his knee. A woman covered her mouth with her fan, her eyes glinting with mischief. The laughter wasn't kind, it was sharp, cutting, and it circled Ruth like wolves around a lamb. Her throat tightened. She wanted to lower her eyes, murmur an apology, and slip back into the safety of the shadows. But something in the way Lawrence held that manuscript, and the way his smirk dared her to be small, made her pause. She drew a slow breath. "Sir," she said softly, her accent coloring the word, "I am only here to serve." Lawrence chuckled, tilting his head mockingly. "Oh, don't be shy. We'll forgive you if you fail. After all, who could expect a maid to know the tongue of kings and scholars? He turned to the crowd, drawing another round of laughter. But imagine the amusement if she tried. The eyes of the guests bore into her. Ruth felt heat rising in her cheeks, a storm of humiliation pressing against her chest. Yet beneath it all was something else, an ember, quiet but fierce, the memory of her grandmother's voice speaking in rhythms older than the walls of this hall. The manuscript's cover, though faded, bore markings she recognized at once. She had grown up with those shapes, those sounds carved into songs sung beneath starlit skies. They weren't the tongue of kings, as Lawrence so smugly claimed. They were the voice of her people. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavy. Slowly, carefully, she lowered it onto a nearby table. The clink of glasses meeting the wood was small, but in the silence it seemed to echo. All eyes watched her as she stepped forward. Lawrence leaned back, swirling his champagne as though he had already won. His grin was wide, his posture relaxed, but in his eyes flickered a spark of curiosity. Was she really going to try? The guests leaned closer, some smirking, others wide-eyed with the anticipation of a spectacle. A journalist in the corner raised his pen, sensing the possibility of a scene worth writing about. Ruth's pulse hammered in her ears. Her feet carried her closer until she stood just before the millionaire, the manuscript between them like a challenge written in ink. She let her hand hover above its cracked surface, her breath steadying as the world seemed to hold still. The laughter had died away now, replaced by murmurs, whispers, and the rustle of silk gowns. Lawrence's smirk lingered, but his eyes watched her more closely than before. Her lips parted. And in that breathless moment, just as she was about to speak, the entire hall leaned in, waiting for the maid to rise, or fall. The hush that filled the grand hall was a living thing, pressing against Ruth's skin as she stood in front of Lawrence. Every eye was upon her, every whisper a weight upon her shoulders. The golden chandeliers still blazed, but it felt as if the light now bore down on her like an interrogation lamp. She could sense the guests' hunger for entertainment. Many of them wanted her to stumble, to embarrass herself, to give them something to laugh at with their champagne. Lawrence thrived on that same hunger, feeding it with every mocking word that dripped from his mouth. He leaned lazily against the edge of a marble column, one hand still swirling his champagne as though this moment were already won. "Come now," he taunted, his voice smooth but laced with poison. "Surely you have something to say? Even if you're wrong, we'll clap for the effort." The crowd chuckled softly at that, a chorus of cruel encouragement. Ruth's gaze lingered on the manuscript. The faded ink was more than words, it was memory, it was heritage. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, lilting and strong, "Never forget who you are, even if the world tries to make you small." She drew a breath, her lips parting to speak. But Lawrence interrupted, raising a finger theatrically. "Wait! Before our maid graces us with her attempt, let's set the stakes properly." He turned toward the crowd, raising his glass high. "One line, that's all I ask. Translate it correctly, and I'll hand over my monthly salary. But if she fails—" He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in. "Then she returns to serving us in silence, as is her place." The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing off the marble walls. Guests clinked glasses, amused by his audacity. A senator's aide leaned toward his companion, whispering, "She's cornered. There's no way out." Ruth felt the weight of every eye, but she also saw something different in a few faces, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of curiosity. Not everyone laughed as freely as Lawrence did. Some leaned forward not in mockery, but in wonder at the possibility that she might surprise them. Lawrence snapped the manuscript open with a flourish, holding it out toward her as though daring her to touch it. The pages crackled, ancient and fragile, the script etched in looping strokes that had carried across centuries. He tapped the page with his index finger. "Here. Read. Or should I say, pretend to read." Her throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. "May I hold it?" That drew a wave of whispers. No servant had ever asked such a thing from Lawrence. He arched an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Bold, aren't we?" Very well. Hold it if you think that will help. He extended the manuscript toward her, his grip lingering a moment longer than necessary, as though to remind her of the power he thought he held. When Ruth's hands closed around the leather-bound book, the crowd shifted restlessly. The contrast was striking, the wealth of the artifact against the plain uniform of a maid. Yet her hands did not tremble. She lifted it carefully, as though the manuscript itself deserved reverence that Lawrence had denied it. She began to read silently, her eyes tracing the lines with ease. Lawrence chuckled under his breath, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Watch, she's just pretending." But the smirk faltered when Ruth finally spoke, her voice carrying across the hall, low but clear. The syllables flowed like water, rich and rhythmic, her accent wrapping perfectly around the ancient words. Guests leaned in closer, captivated. At first, Lawrence laughed again, trying to cover his surprise. "Pretty sounds, I'll grant you. But anyone can mumble nonsense and call it translation." Then, from the corner of the room, the Oxford linguist who had been silent until now suddenly straightened in his chair. His eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly as recognition dawned. "My God, she's correct!" His voice broke the tension like a crack of thunder. Gasps rippled through the audience. Conversations erupted in hushed tones. "She knew it? Is it possible?" "No, surely not." Lawrence's smirk faltered for the first time. "You're mistaken," he snapped, directing his words at the linguist. "How could she possibly know?" The linguist stood, his voice firm now. "Because I've studied fragments of this language for years, and I've never heard anyone speak it aloud with such accuracy. She didn't guess. She read it as naturally as one reads English." The crowd turned their gaze back to Ruth, whose expression remained calm, though her heart thundered in her chest. She lifted her chin, her voice steady as she continued the translation. The line she chose was not random, it was deliberate, each word carrying weight. "The strength of a man is not measured by the gold he holds, but by the dignity with which he treats the least among him." The words echoed into the silence that followed. Every guest felt the sting, for the meaning was unmistakable. The lesson struck directly at Lawrence's arrogance, exposing the cruelty of his mockery. The silence lingered for a breath, then another, until it broke with scattered applause. At first hesitant, then stronger, the clapping spread through the room. The senator's wife, her fan still in hand, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered loudly, "The maid just put him in his place." Lawrence's face flushed crimson, his jaw tight as he tried to recover. He barked out a brittle laugh. "Coincidence. She must have rehearsed. Perhaps she memorized a phrase someone told her. That doesn't prove she can translate the rest." But his protest fell flat. The applause grew louder, and the murmurs of admiration swelled. People began to look at Ruth differently, not as a servant, but as someone who had just revealed a depth none of them had expected. She closed the manuscript gently and handed it back to Lawrence, her eyes meeting his with quiet strength. "You set the challenge, sir. I gave you the answer." The hall waited, breathless. He had made a promise, and now the crowd watched to see if he would keep it. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a strained smile that fooled no one. His fingers clenched around the manuscript, and for the first time in the evening, Lawrence looked small, not in stature, but in spirit. The spotlight that had once flattered him now burned with judgment, and the eyes of his peers, once adoring, now searched for cracks in his armor. And Ruth, standing tall in her simple uniform, had become the center of the room, whether she wished it or not. The suspense tightened like a noose. Would he honor his word, or attempt to humiliate her further? The answer balanced in the air, waiting to fall. The tension in the hall was suffocating. Ruth stood quietly, her hands folded before her, the faint trace of a steady breath escaping her lips. Across from her, Lawrence clutched the manuscript with fingers gone stiff, his knuckles whitening as though letting go of it would mean surrendering the last remnants of his control. The crowd, draped in glitter and perfume, leaned forward in near unison, their curiosity sharpened into expectation. Every guest knew the terms Lawrence had declared, and now they waited for him to make good on his promise, or expose himself as a coward before his own circle. But Lawrence was not a man accustomed to losing. His smirk, though weakened, began to return, sculpted by sheer arrogance. He lifted his chin, trying to turn the humiliation back upon her. "One line," he said, his tone louder, as if volume could mask insecurity. "One line could have been rehearsed. You want us to believe this maid, of all people, has mastered a language scholars spend decades failing to decipher?" He let the question hang, glancing at the faces around him, trying to spark doubt in their minds. Some guests exchanged uneasy looks. The Oxford linguist, however, stepped forward, his voice ringing with conviction. "It wasn't rehearsed. Her pronunciation was flawless, her cadence natural. That kind of fluency isn't learned overnight." His words carried weight, and the room shifted again, leaning further toward Ruth. Lawrence felt the balance tipping, and desperation gleamed in his eyes. He snapped the manuscript open to another passage, shoving it toward her as though thrusting a weapon. "Fine then. If you claim to know this tongue, prove it again. Translate this passage. Right now. No time to think, no chance to cheat." The crowd murmured in approval. Another test, another chance to see whether the maid's first performance had been mere luck. Ruth, however, did not falter. She met his gaze for a lingering moment, then lowered her eyes to the page. The words flowed into her like familiar rivers, each symbol carrying meaning passed down from her ancestors. Her lips parted, and once again she spoke. The hall went silent. Her voice wove through the room with clarity and strength. She translated not only the literal meaning, but the poetic rhythm hidden in the ancient text, asterisk. "Those who rise by trampling the small will fall when the weight of their cruelty turns against them. Justice wears no crown, yet it rules forever." Asterisk. The words carried across the marble and echoed beneath the chandeliers. There was no mistaking the sting. Ruth's eyes flicked briefly to Lawrence as she spoke, but her voice carried no malice. It was calm, resolute, almost gentle, as though the truth itself was enough, no matter how bitter it tasted to the man who had sought her humiliation. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone clapped once, sharply, then again. Soon the sound spread, like rain striking glass, until the hall filled with applause. Guests who had moments ago smirked at her now looked at her with awe, even reverence. Lawrence's composure cracked. His smirk fell away, replaced by a tightness around his jaw, his eyes darting nervously from face to face. He could see the shift in the crowd, could feel the weight of judgment pressing against him. His game had backfired spectacularly. Still, he tried to claw back control. "This is absurd," he barked, raising his voice above the applause. "She could have read about this language somewhere. She could have." "Enough." The linguist cut him off, stepping closer. His face was stern, his voice unyielding. "You made the challenge. Twice she has risen to it. You owe her your salary." The hall erupted with agreement. Voices rose from every corner. "Pay her! You promised! Keep your word!" The pressure was undeniable, and Lawrence's face turned a deeper shade of crimson. His wealth had always shielded him from consequences, but tonight the eyes of his peers were sharp, and the memory of this night would follow him long after the champagne glasses were cleared. Ruth stood motionless through the storm, her face calm, her hands resting lightly before her. Inside, her heart pounded, but she held herself with the dignity of one who knew she was standing not just for herself, but for the voices of those long silenced. She remembered her grandmother's stories, the old songs that others dismissed as relics, and she felt their strength filling her chest like fire. Lawrence, cornered, drew a pen from his breast pocket and tore a check from his book with a sharp rip that carried across the hall. He scrawled his signature with shaking fingers, each stroke a wound to his pride. Finally, he shoved the check toward her, his lips pressed in a grim line. Gasps filled the air as people craned to glimpse the number written there. Even among millionaires, the figure was staggering, more than the yearly salary of several men combined. The weight of it was almost dizzying. Ruth accepted the check but did not look at it. Instead, she lifted her eyes to Lawrence's, her gaze unwavering. "It was never about your money," she said softly, her voice audible in the quiet that followed. "You sought to belittle me, to make me small in front of others. But respect is not yours to grant or deny. It comes from truth, and truth is older than your fortune." The words struck like a bell, reverberating in the silence. The applause that followed shook the hall, louder than before, rolling over Lawrence until he shrank beneath its force. Some guests stood, clapping furiously, their eyes shining with admiration for the maid who had just humbled a millionaire. Others whispered among themselves, speaking of how this night would be remembered. Lawrence turned pale, his hands still clutching the manuscript as though it were the last anchor of his pride. But even the ancient book seemed to mock him now, its words reborn through the voice of the maid he had sought to humiliate. Ruth glanced down at the check once, then gently placed it on a table nearby. "I don't need this," she said, her voice ringing out. "Dignity is worth more than gold." The room roared with approval. Glasses clinked, people cheered, and the applause thundered until it seemed the walls themselves shook. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled, and somewhere in the sea of glittering gowns and sharp suits, reputations were shifting. Lawrence stood hollow, his empire of arrogance crumbling in the face of a single woman's quiet strength. And Ruth, standing in her plain uniform, no jewels adorning her but the fire of truth in her eyes, had become the brightest figure in the room. As the applause washed over her, Ruth felt her grandmother's voice once more, proud and clear in her memory. "Never forget who you are." Tonight, the world had been reminded. And in the lingering silence between claps, everyone knew this was no longer Lawrence's stage. It was hers. The echoes of applause still rattled the chandeliers long after Ruth had spoken. The thunderous clapping, the cries of admiration, the shifting of chairs as people rose to their feet, it was a sound Lawrence had always believed belonged to him. Yet now he stood, half forgotten, as eyes that once adored him turned toward the maid who had shattered his pride with nothing but her voice. The check lay on the table, stark against the polished wood, the ink still fresh. Guests whispered about the figure scrawled there, some marveling at the fortune, others shaking their heads in disbelief at Ruth's refusal to accept it. But for Ruth, the paper meant nothing. It was only a token of his arrogance, and to take it would be to accept that arrogance had power over her. She stood with her hands folded before her, head held high, her face serene even as her heart raced. It was not the salary she had won, it was something far greater. Respect. Dignity. A truth no one in the hall could ever erase. But Lawrence, stripped of his smug mask, refused to surrender quietly. He slammed the manuscript shut with a crack that startled a few of the guests. His voice, rougher now, broke through the applause. "Enough of this circus," he snapped. "You've all been bewitched by a performance, nothing more. A maid parroting words she memorized does not deserve your standing ovation. And I—" His voice caught as he realized the room was no longer his to command. The applause had not fully died down, and in the gap between his words someone shouted, "Keep your promise, Halstead!" Another voice rose, sharper. "You've been shown up, admit it!" Then a third, dripping with scorn. "Dignity, Lawrence! Do you even remember what it means?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, but this time it wasn't at Ruth's expense. It was at his. Lawrence's face burned crimson, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He had built his reputation on control, on wielding his wit like a blade to cut others down. Now the blade was turned inward, and every pair of eyes was watching him bleed. Ruth's voice broke through the noise, steady and clear, not raised in anger but resonant with calm authority. "Sir, you asked me to translate, and I did. Twice. You gave your word before all these witnesses. What you do now will not change what I've said or what they've heard. It will only show them who you are." The words landed with precision, cutting deeper than any insult. Gasps spread through the room, followed by murmurs of agreement. A journalist's pen scratched furiously against paper. He knew tomorrow's headline was writing itself before his eyes. Lawrence opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. The silence that followed was worse than ridicule. It was judgment, heavy and final. The guests who once clamored for his attention now turned their backs, whispering instead about Ruth, about her skill, about her composure. He had meant to reduce her to nothing. Instead, she had risen above him, leaving him stranded in his own humiliation. Finally, with stiff movements, he shoved the manuscript back into his briefcase, snapping the lock shut with trembling hands. His voice was low and bitter when he spoke. "Enjoy your moment. It will be the last." He turned sharply on his heel, his shoes clacking against the marble as he stormed toward the exit. But as he pushed through the doors, someone in the crowd called out, "Remember the words, Lawrence!" Then laughter followed him, rolling through the hall like thunder chasing lightning. He disappeared into the night, his empire of arrogance crumbling behind him. The room remained abuzz, the guests caught between disbelief and exhilaration. Some gathered around Ruth, offering words of admiration. "Remarkable," said one. "Where did you learn that?" asked another. The linguist bowed his head slightly in respect. "You've done tonight what no scholar has managed in decades. You've given voice to history." Ruth smiled faintly, though her eyes softened with humility. "I did nothing extraordinary. I only spoke the words my grandmother gave me. They were never meant to be hidden in museums or sold in auctions. They belong to everyone willing to listen." Her answer left many silent, their champagne glasses suddenly feeling heavy in their hands. The senator's wife lowered her fan and whispered, "What wisdom, from someone we overlooked." The journalist, notebook in hand, stepped forward. "Miss, if I may, your name? The world should know it." Ruth hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on her. But then she shook her head gently. "Names fade. What matters is that the words live on." The guest fell quiet at her humility, struck by the contrast between her and the man who had stormed out moments earlier. Where Lawrence had craved recognition, she refused it. Where he had sought to dominate, she chose to uplift. As the night drew to a close, Ruth slipped quietly from the hall, the murmurs of admiration following her like a gentle tide. The cool night air greeted her outside, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens. She walked slowly, the stars above bright and endless, reminding her of the nights she had once spent as a child listening to her grandmother's stories. She felt no triumph in Lawrence's defeat, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had spoken louder than his pride. She thought of the manuscript, of the words inscribed on its fragile pages, and she knew they would endure long after Lawrence's wealth was forgotten. Inside the hall, the manuscript still sat in his briefcase, silent but damning. Those who had heard Ruth's voice would never forget what had been spoken. The line would echo in their minds, "The strength of a man is not measured by the gold he holds, but by the dignity with which he treats the least among him." And indeed, that was the final judgment on Lawrence Halstead. Ruth walked on, her steps light, her spirit unburdened. She had been mocked, tested, and humiliated before the eyes of the wealthy and powerful, yet she had left with something greater than gold. She had left with her dignity untouched, her heritage honored, and the respect of an entire room. By the time the gala ended and the last guests drifted into the night, the story had already begun to spread. Some recounted the moment with awe, others with shame for having laughed at her before. But all agreed, the maid had triumphed where the millionaire had fallen. And so it was that the night meant to showcase Lawrence Halstead's wealth became instead the night the world remembered the voice of a maid, who spoke ancient words with the power to humble pride and lift dignity above riches. The millionaire had scoffed, but in the end, it was Ruth's voice that endured, and the silence that followed him into the dark was the sound of his empire breaking. And as Ruth disappeared down the quiet street, the words seemed to linger in the air like a blessing. Justice wears no crown, yet it rules forever.